How does a country move from importing 70% of its rice to zero with a single decision? In the heart of West Africa, Burkina Faso lived for decades off ships, arriving from Bangkok, Chennai, and Hanoi. Families measured their survival against cargo schedules. A week of delay in a Thai vessel meant entire towns boiling leaves for dinner children, pressing their hunger into silence. Mothers staring at empty bowls without tears left to shed. The absurdity was clear. Why import what the land beneath their feet could already grow? For years, local farmers with cracked heels and sunburned backs planted seeds not for livelihood, but for shame. Their harvest collapsed under the flood of cheaper Asian grain. Banks lent money only to seize their produce as collateral. French-linked distributors filled the warehouses, dictated the prices, and locked Burkina Faso into dependence. Each meal of imported rice was not nourishment. It was a reminder that the country was eating someone else's future. Then came a single page. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, the presidency released a decree bearing the red seal of the Republic and the unmistakable signature of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. It stated in bold words, effective immediately, all rice imports from Thailand, India, and Vietnam are prohibited. No transition period, no consultation, not a reform, an order, clear, sharp, final. The silence that followed was heavier than the midday heat. Radios stayed tuned longer than usual. Cafes in Ouagadougou froze mid-sentence. In villages around Koudougou and Tenkodogo, elders gathered around battery-powered sets, repeating the decree aloud to make sure they had heard it right. A leader had chosen pride over price, sovereignty over dependency. And with that choice, the balance of power shifted from the ocean to the fields. This was never just about food. It was about freedom. If a nation cannot feed itself, how can it ever call itself sovereign? That is the question that now hangs not only over Burkina Faso, but over an entire continent. Stay with us because this story belongs to every ancestor who once dreamed of standing tall. Comment where you are watching from, and if you believe in a new Burkina Faso, subscribe now. Together, let us rise. Before the decree, Burkina Faso's dinner tables were ruled by distant ports. Every month, container ships from Bangkok, Chennai, and Ho Chi Minh City docked with holds packed full of white grain. It was cheaper than the rice grown at home, not because it was better, but because the system was built that way. 12 French-affiliated distributors held the quiet monopoly. They owned the warehouses, controlled the flows, and set the prices. Local farmers could not compete. They planted with dignity, but they harvested debt. Their children grew up on imported rice while their own fields lay fallow. Foreign advisors repeated the same refrain: Asian rice was more efficient. African rice was too costly. For decades, that logic was accepted until Captain Ibrahim Traoré decided it was surrender. At 9 in the morning, the seal of the Republic announced a break with history. The decree was not phrased as reform, not framed as gradual transition. It was a command that froze the ports and redirected the nation's attention to the land. Within hours, shock spread. The national press hesitated, unsure whether to call it reckless or visionary. Some politicians whispered of looming shortages. Others saw, perhaps for the first time, a government willing to stand for its people rather than its partners. Then came the broadcast. On national television, Traoré appeared in plain fatigues. He did not thunder or demand applause. He simply said, "A country that eats the rice of others is a country waiting to die. We will not do that anymore." The words lasted less than 10 minutes, but the echo carried into every village and every capital office. The question hung in silence: can a country survive without the imports that fed it for decades? The answer came not from speeches, but from soil. The government issued a directive: open all dormant rice lands in 6 provinces. Bagre, Suru, Kompienga, Ganzorgo, Yatenga, and Kuritenga. 10,000 hectares once surrendered to debt and dust were now declared zones of national mobilization. But this was not farming as usual. It was military in scale and civic in spirit. 50,000 men and women reported to the fields. They carried not rifles, but hoes and sacks of seed. Among them stood war veterans with faded uniforms, village youth with smartphones in their pockets, and even prisoners temporarily released under rehabilitation programs. It was the largest agricultural deployment in the country's history. Command posts were established not led by bureaucrats in air-conditioned offices, but by farmers themselves. The Ministry of Agriculture issued a striking order. Every government official, from directors to advisors, would rotate 1 week in the fields working side by side with growers. When asked if ministers would receive salaries for this labor, the answer was swift. No pay, no tents, only sun, sweat, and soil. The turning point arrived when Traoré himself appeared without warning in Compiègne. No entourage, no motorcade, just his boots, a shovel, and a rolled-up shirt. He walked into the rice paddies beside an elderly farmer named Barbara Idrissa, who once fed 5 villages before imports crushed his livelihood. For 4 hours, they planted together in silence. No cameras beyond the state press, no staged performance. When a soldier attempted to salute from the roadside, Traoré looked up and said, "No one stands above the farmer, not even me." That sentence did not simply resonate. It redrew the boundary between power and the people. Politics moved from conference rooms to the fields. Legislation was no longer ink on paper, but water on soil. Yet questions remained heavy in the air. Could local seed varieties grow fast enough to feed 14 million people? What if the rains failed, as they so often do in the Sahel? Could pride outweigh price if foreign rice remained cheaper? International experts called it agricultural populism. Some saw desperation, others saw defiance. Inside the country, skepticism and hope walked side by side. Families reopened granaries long forgotten. Irrigation pumps that had been rusting for years began to hum again. Cooperative groups trained youth in pest control and flood management. Something deeper was happening. Burkina Faso was not only learning to grow again, it was learning to think again. The effort was more than symbolic. It was material. Convoys rolled into the provinces carrying tractors not powered by diesel but by sunlight. Over 3,000 solar tillers commissioned by the government were distributed to rural cooperatives. Alongside them came sealed bags of native rice strains, Wend Yam Pokoala and Yikibala, once dismissed as obsolete because they held little value on global markets. Yet these were the seeds that had fed generations resilient to drought, maturing faster, requiring no chemical intervention. Now they returned as the backbone of a national revival. To manage this new wave, the Ministry of Agriculture introduced a digital platform called Lure Sac, meaning clean rice. Farmers registered their plots, logged irrigation schedules, tracked rainfall, and reported pests through a simple mobile interface. No middlemen, no inflated numbers, no foreign consultants. For the first time, the government had real-time knowledge of its own fields. A commune in Compiègne that exceeded its target yield by 12% was rewarded with new storage tanks. The recognition came not with speeches, but with equipment. Trust was being built in places long abandoned by the state. When the state listened, the people responded, and when the state equipped, the people rose. The decision had transformed rice into more than a crop. It became a line in the sand. Traoré knew the backlash would arrive from European councils, from exporters in Hanoi and Kolkata, from the businessmen who had grown rich on dependency. But his response was not to plead with diplomats. It was to sit with farmers in the public square of Zorgo to hear them speak of irrigation channels, broken tractors, and seed quality. When one elder farmer declared, "We can do this, but not alone," Traoré replied simply, "Then we will not let you stand alone." It was not rhetoric. It was a pact. And in that moment, the foundation of a new chapter was laid. The climax did not unfold in a palace hall, but in the middle of a rice field. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, in plain boots and a rolled shirt, stood ankle-deep in mud beside farmers whose calloused hands had long been ignored. Cameras were few, and the press had not been summoned. What mattered was the sight itself, the president planting seedlings shoulder to shoulder with the people. It was a gesture of humility that carried the weight of revolution. When a soldier saluted from the edge of the road, Traoré lowered his eyes only long enough to say, "No one stands above the farmer, not even me." That single sentence spread faster than any broadcast. It was copied in notebooks, whispered at schoolyards, and repeated in markets. Politics was no longer something discussed in government buildings. It had moved into the fields. The decree had already shaken the system, but this moment gave it flesh and blood. Elders who had seen decades of broken promises listened again to their radios now with cautious belief. Young men who once left for the cities returned to test the soil of their families' farms. Even prisoners temporarily released to join the planting felt something shift. One of them, sowing seeds in Suru, murmured, "I plant today so my son will not steal tomorrow." The campaign had turned farming into an act of redemption and resistance. But outside Burkina Faso, the ripples carried different tones. Export associations in Thailand warned of disrupted contracts. Rice councils in Vietnam and India pressed for dialogue. In Brussels, officials of the European Union issued formal queries on trade agreements. An anonymous diplomat described it as agricultural nationalism, a term meant to cast doubt, yet the phrase revealed unease. If feeding oneself was nationalism, then what was dependency? The International Monetary Fund soon announced a pause on a planned loan program, citing unpredictability. A multinational agriculture firm withdrew from a partnership. An embassy delayed its educational aid budget. Pressure mounted not from hunger inside the country, but from the fear of disobedience spreading across borders. While external voices worried the African continent leaned in. Delegations from Senegal visited solar-powered mills in Suru. Nigeria sent agricultural scientists to observe irrigation methods and logistics. Mali dispatched soil experts to study native seed resilience. They did not arrive as tourists, but as apprentices. Within weeks, the hashtag #GrowOurOwnRice trended across 13 African nations. From Kampala to Abidjan, radio debates challenged old assumptions. In Ghana, a morning show asked bluntly, if Burkina Faso can reclaim its dinner plate, what is stopping us? In Johannesburg University, students organized a march holding banners that read, "No rice, no rights." Inside Burkina Faso, reactions were not uniform. The Chamber of Commerce feared retaliation through tariffs. Export-oriented businesses warned of capital flight. Economists predicted inefficiencies in state-run food systems. Yet the pride of ordinary citizens grew louder than the warnings. In Dori, a school headmaster told his students, "For the first time, what you eat was grown by your neighbors." In Ouagadougou, families scanned QR codes on bags of rice and saw the names of local farmers displayed on their phones. Some wept as they recognized familiar names erased by 30 years of anonymous trade. Cafes, canteens, and hospitals began labeling meals with the origin of their rice. Children started asking, "Whose rice are we eating today?" That question was not trivial. It was political awakening disguised as curiosity. Foreign media continued to describe the policy as reckless populism, yet they failed to see the human transformation it unleashed. Granaries reopened irrigation pumps word again. Youth cooperatives trained in flood management. Elders taught seed preservation, and communities reclaimed forgotten rice strains once dismissed as worthless. What outsiders labeled inefficiency, insiders called memory. And in that memory, they found strength. The tension grew sharper when a consortium of international importers demanded compensation for broken contracts totaling more than $12 million. The government's response was 3 lines long. "We owe no compensation for choosing to survive. We regret your loss. We will not resume imports." Those words unsettled boardrooms in Paris and Bangkok far more than the decree itself. It was not only defiance, but also clarity. Through all the backlash, the fields continued to fill. Solar-powered tractors dug rows under the Sahel sun. Farmers logged their yields through the Lure-Sac platform, reporting pests and rain with the efficiency of a decentralized network. Within 6 weeks, 46,000 users were active daily. In Koudougou, teenagers ran a help desk for illiterate elders, translating digital inputs into action. A grandmother tracked soil acidity with a handheld meter, smiling as she declared she now knew more about her land than the traders who once priced her grain. The climax of this story was not a single speech or a diplomatic standoff. It was the collision of 2 forces: the resistance of a system built on dependency and the insistence of a people ready to reclaim their food, their dignity, and their sovereignty. Traoré had thrown the first stone, but it was the farmers who carried it forward. The question now lingered far beyond Burkina Faso. What happens when other nations decide they too will stop importing their survival? The decree did not remain a piece of paper in the capital. Its effects rippled into the daily lives of millions. Across the countryside, families reopened long-abandoned granaries. Pumps that had rusted for years began to hum again. In villages from Kompienga to Yatenga, neighbors gathered to share seeds, tools, and knowledge. What had once been fields of dust were slowly turning green. The nation was not only planting rice, it was planting confidence. For ordinary people, the consequences were immediate. Farmers who had been driven to despair by imported grain began to see dignity return with each seedling. Cooperative groups formed to manage irrigation, pest control, and milling. In Kudugu, a young collective trained teenagers in soil monitoring, while grandmothers learned to test pH levels with handheld meters. Ex-convicts, once defined by their past, now spoke proudly of their new role. One man whispered as he bent over his field, "I sow rice today, so my son will not steal tomorrow." That sentence captured the civil impact better than any policy document. Farming was no longer just survival, it had become restoration. Schools, hospitals, and canteens began displaying the origin of their rice. Bags marked with QR codes told stories of local hands. A meal in a secondary school could trace its grain back to Isada Cabaret's plot in Zorgo. A hospital in Wahaguya served rice harvested by Abdullah Sanu in Suru. Children asked their parents whose rice they were eating that day. For the first time in decades, food was not anonymous. It carried memory. It carried identity. It carried pride. Elders who had lived through cycles of dependence wept quietly as they recognized the names of neighbors printed on sacks in public markets. The government formalized the transformation with the creation of the National Grain Authority. Its mission was not only to dismantle the monopoly of foreign distributors, but to replace it with a sovereign system. Within 10 days, all licenses of private rice traders were revoked. Distribution pricing and reserves fell under the authority of the state. Critics called it centralization. Supporters called it survival. For over 20 years, French-owned warehouses dictated how Burkina Faso ate. Now the system shifted to solar-powered mills built with national funds. 13 new plants were commissioned, designed by local engineers, and powered by modular panels adapted to the Sahel's sun. The first in Kaya processed 4 tons per hour, outperforming 2 older mills previously controlled by foreign firms. This was not efficiency for profit. It was efficiency for dignity. Politically, the consequences were even deeper. Ministries that once negotiated trade contracts in French now sat with farmers to discuss irrigation schedules and harvest yields. Civil servants who had never touched soil rotated into the fields, working side by side with villagers. The sight of a minister bent over seedlings erased decades of distance between rulers and ruled. It was not perfect. Some resisted the change, others doubted the solar tillers, and a few dismissed the app as a passing fad. But the errors were theirs to own, and so was the progress. The Chamber of Commerce warned of tariffs. Export-oriented firms feared capital flight. Economists predicted inefficiencies. Yet these warnings faded against the visible changes in daily life. A headmaster in Dori told his students, "For the first time, what you eat was grown by your neighbors." In Ouagadougou, families ate together with a sense of pride that price could not measure. Food was no longer just sustenance. It was sovereignty on a plate. The political symbolism extended beyond agriculture. By dismantling private monopolies and revoking foreign licenses, the government signaled a new model of governance, one that rejected dependency as inevitable. For the first time in decades, the state did not manage crisis with loans or aid, but with mobilization of its own people and resources. The decision inspired solidarity marches in other African capitals and debates in universities about post-colonial sovereignty. The African Union convened an emergency session not to condemn, but to study the model. Could this be the beginning of a new continental path? The risks remained. Roads to new mills were unpaved. App servers crashed on old phones, and yields still depended on the mercy of rain. But failure, if it came, would belong to Burkina Faso alone, not to foreign contracts or imported dependency. That difference mattered. It marked a new chapter in the nation's political memory. Pride was beginning to outweigh price. And in the quiet of rural fields, a new generation was learning that sovereignty was not a slogan. It was something planted, watered, harvested, and eaten together. The world could not ignore what had happened. For decades, Burkina Faso had been a silent consumer at the global table of rice. Suddenly, it had stood up, flipped its plate, and declared that it would eat only what it grew. The reaction abroad was swift. Export associations in Thailand and Vietnam warned of market disruptions. India pressed for dialogue. The European Union issued formal queries demanding clarity on how trade agreements would be honored. The words they chose were technical, but the sentiment behind them was unmistakable. A small African nation had broken the script. In Brussels, an anonymous official described the policy as agricultural nationalism. The term was meant to sound critical, but it revealed more unease than contempt. If feeding oneself was nationalism, what was dependency? The question unsettled not only European policymakers, but also corporate boardrooms in Paris and Singapore. The International Monetary Fund paused a planned loan program, citing unpredictability. A multinational agriculture firm withdrew a partnership proposal. An embassy quietly delayed its funding for an education initiative. Pressure mounted, but the government did not flinch. It issued a 3-line response to a consortium of international importers demanding $12 million in compensation. We owe no compensation for choosing to survive. We regret your loss. We will not resume imports. The message was clear. Sovereignty had no price tag. In Washington, the official response was muted, but American analysts began to debate the implications. Could a model like this spread? Could African nations reject dependence without destabilizing global trade flows? Some commentators warned that if such defiance became contagious, it could redraw the entire map of food security. Others reflected more personally. One American columnist asked if our families depended on imports for every meal, would we accept it quietly? What does independence mean if a nation cannot feed itself? Across Africa, the tone was different. The African Union convened an emergency session not to condemn, but to study. Delegations from Senegal, Nigeria, and Mali had already traveled to see the solar mills and the native seeds in action. Ghanaian television ran breakfast debates where panelists asked if Burkina Faso can reclaim its dinner plate. What is stopping us? Students in Johannesburg marched with banners declaring "No rice, no rights." The idea was spreading faster than the grain itself. This was no longer just a national story, it was continental. For the West, the events in Burkina Faso were a challenge to the narrative that food security required global integration loans and aid. For Africans, it was evidence that sovereignty could be lived, not just spoken. The tension between these views is still unresolved, but the question now lingers in every capital. If a small nation like Burkina Faso can break free, what excuse do larger nations have for remaining bound? From ships loaded with foreign grain to solar-powered tractors in village fields, Burkina Faso's journey was never simply about rice. It was about reclaiming the meaning of sovereignty. The story began with dependence, with families waiting for cargo boats to dock in order to eat. It reached its turning point with a decree that stunned the world, and with the president planning side by side with farmers in the mud. And it now moves toward a future where each grain of rice carries the name of the hands that grew it. The impact stretches far beyond food. It touches memory. For decades, imported rice erased the presence of local farmers, turning meals into anonymous transactions. Today, a bag of rice scanned with a phone reveals a farmer's name, a harvest date, a commune, even the weather of the week it was grown. Children ask, "Whose rice are we eating?" Elders cry as they see names they once knew. What was lost in silence is now being restored in data, in pride, and in daily life. This shift is not perfect. Roads remain unpaved, servers crash, and rainfall is uncertain. The risks are real. If the harvest fails, the same world that now watches with curiosity will laugh and point fingers. But even that failure would belong to Burkina Faso alone. It would not be dictated by traders in Paris or councils in Bangkok. It would be owned by the people themselves. And that is the essence of sovereignty. The lesson extends far beyond Ouagadougou. If one nation can choose to stop importing hunger, others can too. If one people can decide that food is more than price, that it is dignity, then the rest of Africa has no reason to wait. The continent holds the soil, the sun, and the rain. What it has lacked is the decision. Burkina Faso has shown what that decision looks like. For viewers in America, Europe, or anywhere else, this story raises a mirror. What does independence mean if the food on your table is shipped from oceans away? What kind of security is it when the survival of your children depends on contracts signed in foreign languages? These are questions not only for Africans, but for anyone who values sovereignty in practice, not just in words. So what does this mean for you, for your community, for the future your grandchildren will inherit? These are not abstract questions. They are as real as the grain cooked tonight in homes across Burkina Faso. If you believe Africa must never again be defined by dependency, write in the comments what sovereignty means to you. Share this story not for algorithms, but for memory. Subscribe if you want to follow a journey that is not about headlines, but about history in the making. Because in the end, this is not only about rice. It is about refusing to kneel in a world that expects you to. It is about standing tall with soil-stained hands and saying, "We grow, we eat, we decide."